Hi everyone, and welcome to today's symposium, which is part of our exhibition with the wonderful collective Cailleacha. This live stream symposium will be running throughout the day and is in conjunction with our exhibition, The Age of Reason, Unreason. This exhibition is supported by the Arts Council of Ireland, Tipperary County Council and Bealtaine. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Lena Tobin. I am the Artistic Director here at the Arts Centre. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the day, how it's going to run, and also a little bit of information about the group in Cailleacha for those of you who are experiencing this for the first time and haven't been to see our show. So Cailleacha is the Irish word for witches or hags, which I'm sure a lot of you know. And this collective are a collective of 8 older women, all based in Ireland, but coming out of various countries such as Holland, England, and Switzerland. There are 6 artists, 1 musician, and 1 art writer/curator. They are bent on exploring ways of working together, of looking at collective experience, of attitudes to aging and the wider community, as well as how female bodies and aging relates to culture and heritage. Their experience of COVID and the related isolation has also inspired their collective work. This exhibition, which is the first ever showing of their work, was inspired and the result of a 1-month-long residency which they had at the Ballinglenna Arts Foundation in September of 2020. Luckily, they found the 1 or 2 months that we had out of lockdown in order for them to form a pod and work together. We'll see a lot of the time that they spent together, and we'll see how they developed their work during the screening of the documentary by Terry Rudin later in the afternoon.
Hello, I'm Catherine Marshall. Thank you, Helena, for that very nice introduction to our group. This exhibition and symposium is called Cailleacha, The Age of Reason and Unreason, and that's for the very good reason that we're looking at how we make art as we age, but also because we're very interested in the problems, not least senility and loss of capacity that happens to people as they get older. So we're starting off this morning by looking at arts and health. Our first speaker will be Professor Roseanne Kenny, who is the Professor of Medical Gerontology at Trinity College in Dublin, where she is also head of the academic discipline of medical gerontology, director of the Falls and Blackout Unit at St. James's Hospital, and director of the Mercer Institute for Successful Aging, commonly known as MESA. One of the things that Roseanne is really, I suppose, driven by is a passion to help people to age successfully and, in other words, healthily. She is concerned, therefore, with physical and neurovascular illnesses that affect stability and mobility. She's one of the principal investigators behind the Irish longitudinal study on aging, which is called TILDA. It's a 10-year-long study that has drawn in something like 8,500 people, looking at changes in them over a period of 10 years. And her research is really all driven by a desire to enable people to live independently for as long as possible. So I'd love to hand you over now to Professor Roseanne Kenny. She's coming to us virtually with a pre-recorded speech that she made for us. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Roseanne Kenny, Professor of Medical Gerontology at Trinity and at Mercer's Institute in St. James's Hospital. I'm very happy to be speaking to you today at the Symposium on Arts, Aging and Health. So I'm going to share my slides with you now. You'll have to bear with me because I've had to get a different computer from my own to do this today. Because of the hacking, we have no access in the hospital, and I'm working in the hospital today. So bear with me for a moment and I'll try and share slides as well as I can. So I'm going to speak to you today on creativity, collaboration, aging, and health. And let's first of all reflect a little bit on the background to this. Why do we age? Most people think that it's all about genes and there's very little that we can do out with genes, but actually this is not the case, and this is where creativity is so important to understanding the biology of aging and how we can manipulate how we age. Genes are actually only responsible for 20% of the aging process. 80% of our lifespan, of how long we live, is attributable to environmental factors, factors that are not related to genes, but are part of the tapestry of how we are living. And one of the main components of those so-called environmental factors, and that doesn't mean the air, although it contributes to it, or the trees, although they contribute to it, but it's the much bigger holistic picture of environmental factors. One of those principal factors is social engagement, which overlaps very significantly with creativity. And I want to take you back to the lovely story of Rosetta with respect to social engagement. Rosetta is a town outside of Rome, about 60 kilometers outside of Rome in Italy. And it shot to fame because of its contribution to the science behind biological aging. The town itself is organized around a central church, and you've got a number of multi-storied houses, almost like one on top of the other. I mean, if anything, you're looking at a village with urban crowding, etc. So the houses are very closely nested together. And at the end of the 18th century, the people of Rosetta in Italy, they were very impoverished. There was very little employment. They heard about the new promised land in the States, and they started to emigrate to America. And they particularly emigrated to Bangor in Pennsylvania and established their own Rosetto, Pennsylvania. And they established it in very much the same structure as the village that they had left behind, or town that they had left behind in Italy. Now, one summer, an epidemiologist from another university out with Pennsylvania had a summer house nearby, was visiting and gave a lecture to local general practitioners in the area. And he was talking about the big killer at the time. And the big killer at the time was cardiovascular disease. Men were dying in their 40s and 50s from heart attacks, not uncommonly. So he was speaking to this. And after the lecture, one of the general practitioners went up to him. This is the general practitioner from Rosetta, as opposed to any of the other towns around nearby, and said, you know what? I don't see that high death rate you're speaking of from heart attacks in Rosetta. So Wolf became very interested in this, wondering, ooh, why would that be? Why wouldn't Rosetta in Pennsylvania have the same heart attacks rates as elsewhere in the USA? And first of all, he thought, well, the facts and figures can't be right. But he looked at the records, he looked at the death certification records and found that, yeah, it looked like there was a 10, even 15-year difference in Rosetta in Pennsylvania in terms of the ages that people were dying from heart attacks and heart diseases compared to elsewhere in the USA. So he was really interested in this, and he took medical students the following summer, and they took over the town hall in Rosetta, and he measured blood pressure. They looked at diet. They looked at genetics, because they were able to compare Rosettans who had emigrated to Rosetta, Pennsylvania, compared to Rosettans who had emigrated to other towns in the USA. And they found that no, when Rosettans emigrated elsewhere, they had similar death rates from heart disease to elsewhere in the USA, but not in Rosetta, Pennsylvania. They looked at their physical activity, they looked at smoking, at all of the factors that we know contribute to heart disease, contribute to early death from heart disease, didn't seem to be applying to this particular population. And then one Sunday morning, it occurred to Stuart Wolf what was going on. He was sitting on a Sunday morning in the square, watching Rosettans pour out of church, and this is in the USA. And then he realized that the secret of Rosetta was Rosetta itself. They visited each other, stopping to chat with others in Italian on the street, cooked for each other in the backyards. He learned about the extended family clans. As you can see from the previous slides, their housing structure was very similar to that in the original Italian town or village, where houses were piled one on top of the other. So invariably, you were meeting people all of the time. They saw that many homes had 3 generations living under one roof, and how much respect was afforded to grandparents. At Mass, he saw the unifying and calming effect of the church. There were 22 separate civic organizations in a town of 2,000 people. So think of it, 2,000 people, there are 22 different clubs. You're very busy going to clubs and meeting people. And there was an egalitarian ethos in the town. It discouraged wealthy people from flaunting their success and helped the unsuccessful obscure their failures. So it became clear to Stuart Wolf that the secret of Rosetta was Rosetta itself. And he wrote a very important textbook on this in the 1940s with a social scientist colleague of his, John Broome, where they, for the first time, described the association between lifespan, death rates, and what appeared to be the fabric of a society and social engagement, social interactions. And they also published the first paper on this in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1964, citing the unusually low incidence of death from heart attacks in the Italian-American community in Pennsylvania. Well, since then, we've had a load of papers on this very subject, underscoring social relationships and death rates. And this particular paper that I've pulled out actually highlights in what's called a meta-analysis, which is a form of scientific analysis, combining 148 studies over 300,000 people, showing that there's a 50% increased likelihood of survival because of strong social relationships. The same risk for heart disease and death as smoking, as alcohol excess, as poor physical activity, or as having a high cholesterol. Now, this is remarkable. How could it possibly be that the influence of social relationships on your likelihood of dying is as strong as these other well-known risk factors? But it is the case. So let's see, why would that be the case? Before I come to that, I just want to show you this other lovely data, which combines all of these risk factors, mostly from that meta-analysis we've looked at, and the contribution that each of those risk factors makes to death. So clean air contributes about 0.05 to your likelihood of dying. High blood pressure, that much. Lean versus overweight, that much. Exercise, that much. Cardiac rehabilitation after you've had a heart attack adds that much to lifespan. Having a flu vaccine adds that much, more than any of these other factors. Stopping drinking excessively adds that much. Quitting smoking, huge effect. But look at close relationships. The biggest effect so far contributes to 60% of lifespan. And social integration, the number of different interactions you have during the day, is the biggest contributor of all. So with respect to creativity, the more you're engaging, the more you're meeting, the more you're sharing, the stronger the impact on healthy, longer lifespan. Remarkable data. And we've actually shown ourselves in the Tilda study that this is the case, that volunteering, social participation, looking after grandchildren are associated with higher quality of life, less physical disorders, and less depressive symptoms. And all of this was also really nicely underpinned by work in the blue zones, which are the longevity spots in the world, the spots in the world where people are living longest. And they are Loma Linda in California, Nicoya in Costa Rica, Sardinia in Italy, Icaria in Greece, and Okinawa in Japan. And not only do people live longer in these locations, but they live better. They live with better long-term health. A large proportion live over the age of 100, 6 times more, for example, in Sardinia than in mainland Italy, and 10 times more than in the USA. And they remain, in general, active and well into their 90s, and typically don't get the chronic diseases that are so common to us and other industrialized nations, like high blood pressure, arthritis, dementia, indeed, and heart disease, of course. Elsewhere in the world, women live generally 6 to 8 years longer than men, but not in the blue zones, where men live as long as women, and many live well into their 90s, and indeed many into their hundreds and beyond. So there isn't that gender difference in lifespan, and this difference is attributed to social engagement. What you see in these blue zones is loved ones come first. Having close and strong family connections with parents, grandparents, grandchildren is very important to blue zone families. Being part of the right tribes, having close friends, strong social networks, and a sense of belonging. Indeed, being part of a faith-based community adds, from research, anything from 4 to 14 years to life expectancy. And that's not just about faith and what the additional maybe security that faith gives you, but it's very much about social interaction and social engagement and frequency of engaging with different people that's afforded by practicing different faiths. Now, we share a lot of our DNA with friends, believe it or not. We share the same genetics with our friends as we do a fourth cousin. And that's the same as the sort of genetics we share with our spouses, indeed. So is there something about friendship and genetics and something else that contributes biologically to living longer if you have strong social friendships and social engagement? And indeed there is, and there are things that not only do we share genetics with friends, and that might influence some of our longevity because of those shared genes. That's too, although they're important, it's too remote. There's a much more immediate reason for the association between social engagement and biological aging, living longer, healthier. And there's a lovely study about this baboon from southern Kenya. She was called the Queen of Mean because when she had her offspring, her only offspring, a daughter, they were very close, but she behaved very badly. And when she was once she had her offspring was her only friend, and she lorded it over other baboons, behaving like a queen bee, fighting with everybody else, biting or whacking other animals, etc., who failed to move out of her way, basically bullying other animals. However, unfortunately, when her daughter died, her behavior changed. because she's, like we are, is a gregarious animal. She needed the social company, social engagement. So she started grooming other offspring and befriending other monkeys, knowing that she needed that innately. She was aware that she needed that for her survival. And we know from a number of studies that loneliness and social isolation trigger inflammation. And that's what innately that queen of mean baboon understood. And it triggers stress hormones, both in animals and humans, which are ultimately bad for us and are underpin why chronic diseases occur. And we know from primate studies that if a monkey is rendered friendless for a period of time, in other words, socially isolated or lonely, that we actually see hard biological changes in their lymph nodes, which are the body's engine for inflammation and immunity. And those changes are particularly in the friendless monkey triggering of inflammatory genes, and then suppression of activity in genes that protect against viruses and inflammation. There's also very good animal work showing that social isolation and loneliness in monkeys triggers the production of fibrinogen, which is a clotting protein, much higher in these monkeys. And that clotting protein is well described to be associated with heart attacks. Therefore, this causing the link for us between social isolation, loneliness, being friendless, and having higher rates of heart disease, both through inflammatory pathways and through clotting pathways, blocking arteries. And there's been a new study on social isolation also linked in humans to higher levels of inflammation and to stress hormones such as cortisone increasing in the system, adrenaline, and noradrenaline. Now, being lonely and social isolation isn't just about stress, isn't just about inflammation and heart attacks. It also has a direct effect on brain function. We know from recent work that our brains can form new brain cells, new blood vessels, and new communication bridges between brain blood cells. And these are all really important for brain reserve capacity. So we've got if we lose brain cells for whatever reason, even through early dementing processes, these reserve capacity of new brain cells, blood vessels, and communication bridges affords us an opportunity to compensate for the loss of cells. That's what we mean by reserve capacity. And creativity, together with physical activity and social contact, social engagement, enhance these reserve features. So they're really important for new brain cell formation throughout the lifespan. The areas that are most involved in new brain cell formation are the hippocampus, which converts short-term memory to long-term memory, so really important that that's kept active. The olfactory bulb, which is here and is responsible for our sense of smell just above the nose. And you'll all know that that's played a huge role recently in COVID and, if you like, entry of the virus into the brain system. You'll be aware that patients with COVID often complain of loss of smell. It's one of the most common initial features. And new brain cells and new blood vessels also form predominantly in the cerebral cortex, which is here, which is responsible for concentration, this big area here, concentration, understanding, awareness, thought, memory, language, and consciousness. So new brain cell formation is involved in the three main areas in the brain for brain function. And you can understand that having new brain cells prevents dementia or facilitates the reserve we were talking about, so that should some cells become demented, we can rely on our reserve capacity so that dementia doesn't become apparent. It isn't obvious. We know from the TILDA study, where we have 8,500 participants over the age of 50 being reassessed every 2 years, the importance of creativity, friendship, social engagement. And to give you some sense of the impact of COVID, we did a TILDA wave during COVID. So we had data collection just prior to COVID, on the eve of COVID, and then we collected data during the first wave. This is the first wave of COVID between July and November, and showed that loneliness was very common. So here on the left is the frequency of loneliness as measured by the UCLA loneliness scale, which is a very valid tool. And participants in TILDA who were 50 and over, mean age 64, sometimes had experienced loneliness, often only in 5%. But during COVID, which is on the right here in light blue, the prevalence of loneliness increased by 2.5 times and was most common in people who were living alone or had poor physical health or poor mental health. And you can see that the curve and the distribution from the left-hand graph has shifted to the right in the right-hand graph, so that the levels of loneliness at the different grades in the scale were common in the higher end of the scale, meaning more likely to be lonely some of the time, often or very often. So during COVID, we lost the capacity or the ability, because of policy decisions, which were probably necessary at the time, to engage in interactive creativity with others, to engage in collaboration, in social engagement, social interaction. And you remember the graph I showed you where there was an association between all of the different risk factors we know of and death. Social engagement and the frequency of social interaction were the strongest factors to influence mortality. All of that was taken away. And actually our TILDA data shows that those who suffered most during COVID in the context of loneliness were the people who had had more social engagement and frequency of interaction pre-COVID, because they were more used to that than those who had lived with less frequent interactions before COVID. So creativity, collaboration are very important for healthy aging. And not just in the context of COVID, but generally as a society, we really need to reflect on how we can enhance social engagement. And creativity is part of that engagement. It's if you like, a cheap and cheerful way to ensure healthier lifespan, and should be incorporated as one of our public health policy initiatives with respect to healthy aging, and therefore supported as such. This is particularly so given the strength of the effect of engagement and social interaction, social activity, more so than any other single intervention, which is remarkable. And the fact that we know that social engagement is something that can be introduced at any time during our lifespan and can have lifelong influences. So I want to thank our funders, the Department of Health, HRB, SFI, NIH, NIA, Atlantic Philanthropies, Irish Life, and indeed the European Commission EIT programme. But in particular, with respect to this talk, we have had support from Creative Ireland to interrogate Tilda about loneliness and social engagement and creativity. And I'll have more data with respect to that in about 8 months' time. And they've also supported innovative interaction on the hospital side, Mercer's Institute for Successful Aging, where creativity during COVID has made a huge difference to health and well-being of patients who were not able to see visitors, etc., during their confinement in hospital. On staff, their health and well-being, when they, during terribly pressurized times, suddenly encountered a creative activity in Mercer's Institute, which is where we held most of the creative activities, be it choir through media, be it a harpist, be it a poetry reading, again through media, be it art exhibitions, whatever. It just afforded staff an opportunity to step back from the pressures they were under and absorb themselves in creativity, which relaxes all of those stress zones. So I encourage creativity collaboration for healthy and better aging. And I know that your organization is also promoting same. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roseanne. That was inspiring and full of information that I think most of us non-medical people would not have had access to, like the extraordinary importance of social engagement relative to those other things that we've been preached at for so many years, like smoking and high blood pressure and all of those things that older people especially are almost worn out hearing. Of course, guaranteeing social engagement is quite challenging, and that's one of the things that we're all about in our group in the Cailleacha. I think we might come back to some further discussion about the arts and health aspects of your talk and indeed of what Cailleacha can do very soon. But before that, I want to introduce the poet and writer Grace Wells. Grace is going to talk about the role of older women in arts and literature, but just to give you a little bit of background information about Grace herself. She came to Ireland from London, where she had been an independent video and television producer for a number of years. She came to Ireland and settled, I don't know whether this was immediately or not, but in Slievenamon. So on Slievenamon, she has a connection to the area of Clonmel. She was a writer in residence here, a literature officer for Stack as early as 2001. Prior to that, she'd done very important work working with people in the Camphill community near Jerpoint in Kilkenny. And I'll just come back to the mention of Slievenamon for a moment. Slievenamon is famously the mountain of the women, connected with serious Irish mythology around women and feminism in particular. I don't know if Grace intends to talk about that in a couple of moments when I hand over to her, but it obviously was a good place to breed some of those thoughts that feed into her own writing. She's been involved in helping people with disabilities to work on their own writing, in particular to consider their own biographical writing. She has also worked with older people. She has published a prize-winning novel for children, and of course her own poetry collection, When God Has Been Called Away, was published in 2010 and was shortlisted for a number of very prestigious awards, including the Patrick Kavanagh Poetry Prize. She's now writing short stories, which she says are not really short stories at all. They're very long short stories, but she's in that process now. And she's moved from Slievenamon, I'm sorry to say, to Clare, which is also a good place to be. And she's coming to us from there now. I'd like to welcome Grace Wells. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. It's lovely to be with you here today. I want to begin by saying that I was given the brief to speak about the representations of older women, witches and hags in literature and myth. And my immediate impulse was to diverge a little from what that might look like, to go toward what we don't know, what we don't see in literature and myth. And I will, of course, touch on what we do see, but I'm personally more fascinated by what is absent from the literary culture around the Cailleacha and the hag. So I'd like to begin shortly by reading a poem that I recently wrote in tribute to Evan Boland. Evan Boland was of the same generation as the artists exhibiting here today, and was one of a number of women poets who managed to break through the all-male Irish literary scene to carve herself a life within poetry. She herself wrote a beautiful poem called Irish Poetry, which points us towards the Irish pantheon of gods and goddesses, at the centre of which is the Cailleacha, who created the world. To understand the Cailleacha, we have to look at the bridge between the feminine and the divine. In our era, most of the world's religions have deemed God as a masculine entity and have therefore afforded an elevated status to the masculine. But to reveal the Cailleacha, we need to turn towards matriarchy and the way that revering a goddess reveals the immanence within women. To speak of the Cailleacha is to simultaneously reach towards a goddess and towards the sacred within the feminine. The Cailleacha was originally the earth goddess of this region, and by this region I mean our northwestern islands, now known as Scotland, Ireland, England and Wales. She belongs to the time between the end of the last ice age and the rise of the Celtic cultures. As earth goddess, she brought our world into being, created this landscape and all its creatures and plant species. Sometimes called the Queen of Winter or the Veiled One, she is the womb of the world that birthed everything, and her presence imbued women with a sanctity that our modern culture can find difficult to perceive. I'll read my poem Pantheon in tribute to Evan Boland and to the artists exhibiting here today. Pantheon. When they tell me of your times, your works, masculine attended birth, the poetry establishment's closed rank, I think of Zeus, so afraid his unborn child would overthrow him, he swallowed her. They say Athena cleaved herself from the god's forehead, fully grown. Patron goddess of heroic endeavor, your armor was quiet dignity. A woman speaking of a woman's world, casting shy light on small details, making our otherness matter, like Athena who presided over household crafts, especially weaving, which lets me see now that all is done, and you have slipped away too early, like a woman leaving a party unannounced, an Irish exit. You were never Greek, but of your own beloved pantheon, goddess of the new spring, Bridget, weaving a threshold belt of stars, a circular kriss to guide the next generations in across the dark. The women pour through now, Ivan. You've borne a library of verse, all of us under your Aegeus, whichever you were, Athena, Bridget. I only knew you as the Cailleacha, the creatrix who shaped the landscape. Artistic expression lets us live from within a glistening landscape of discovery, from within an ever unfolding energetics of possibility, deeply connected to a creative essence, which we call by many names, the muse, the unconscious, and which today I'd like to name as the Cailleacha. We can try to understand the Cailleacha as a creatrix or matrix of intelligences. She is, in many ways, northwestern Europe's Gaia, our living planet as divinity, a supra-intelligence who endlessly manifests creativity within nature and within human beings. Like most goddesses, our early ancestors gave her a face, or more exactly, faces. The Cailleacha has a maiden, a mother, and an elder wise woman aspect. But in essence, she is all three. All her faces are aspects of the one divine creative force. Much as women endlessly metamorphose between our different aspects of selfhood, the earth goddess of this place moves between her manifestations as the year turns. But whatever face she presents, she is always essentially the Cailleacha. Here, she was ritually celebrated at the moon festivals of Imbolc, Bealtaine, Lunasa, and at Samhain, the Celtic New Year, when she puts away her summer face and reasserts herself as Queen of Winter, the older, wise woman in her true primordial nature of darkness, stillness, truth, bone, metallic ore, a blend of creative spirit and essential matter. The Irish earth goddess was never an abstract concept, but was rather the core truth at the centre of social and cultural life. For any high king to rule, he had to ritually marry the earth goddess each year, and his sovereignty was dependent on his relationship with the land. In each of her three manifestations, she is a deeply compassionate figure. As the womb of the world, she is almost endlessly giving, displaying limitless manifestations of creativity. But the Cailleacha is also the limiter, the divine energy that, like Kali, the destroyer from India, she knows when to say no, to call a halt, to end things, and slap humanity back into recognizing its place within the larger scheme of the cosmos. For many centuries, Ireland retained a sense of worship around two of the Cailleacha's faces by assimilating her mother aspect into Mary, Mother of Christ, and by canonizing or making a saint of Bridget, goddess of the spring. We still have some access to Bridget lore that reminds us the Cailleacha is a goddess of birth and death, midwife to life, who brings us into this world, guides us through life, and then shelters us as we pass over at death. Pretty much all that I know about the Cailleacha has come to me through the incredible work of scholar and academic Mary Condren, who wrote The Serpent and the Goddess, and who has given so much of her life to collecting oral and written Bridget and Cailleach knowledge. Through Condren's work, I can understand the Cailleach as earth goddess, not unlike Gaia and Demeter, but also entirely different because she is of this place. She doesn't look like Demeter, goddess of grape and grain. Having created this landscape, the Cailleach is more like Connemara, like the Kerry Mountains, and all the weathers and creatures and plants of this place. Ireland has a very Cailleach climate. It can be a place of spring and summer, but it is also wet and dark and difficult to live in. Our earth goddess has a lot of dark, windswept, bone-like Queen of Winter qualities. It is likely she came to us from the Indo-European route of Kali, the destroyer. In Buddhism, one of the four noble truths is that life is suffering, and I believe the Cailleach would tell us that too. Her essence is the beauty and wonder and terror and tragedy of life. She is not unlike the dark goddess Regana from Lithuania, but she is particularly of this place and manifests as hill and mountain, as hawthorn, hazel, willow, and rowan. To relate to her, we need to know the nature of this place, its seasons, and the way the light falls on the hills, the way the wind moves over the lakes. While the Cailleach's two aspects of sensual maiden and nurturing mother remained acceptable within our culture, the Cailleach herself, the primordial force of creativity behind the maiden, mother, and wise elder, was too large an essence to be assimilated into Christianity. As a direct rival to God, she could only be denounced, and her great wisdom demeaned, so that her powers were only remembered in her crone or hag aspect, a diminished figure of darkness. And as the goddess was denigrated, so too was her earthly representative, the older woman. Although there are still place names and rocks across Ireland that remember the Cailleach, like Hag's Head in County Clare and the Hag of Beara on the Beara Peninsula, all that we really have left of her is within myth and fairy tale. Having once been earth goddess, she was transmuted into the wicked witch, the cruel stepmother, the frightening, rotten-toothed old hag. We know her, and yet we don't know her, because we have ever been taught to shy away from her ugliness, her dark spells, her age, her decay, her evil. But I don't believe the Cailleach is in any way evil. Rather, I understand her as powerful. Female power has been unwelcome within patriarchy for a very long time. During the last 150 years of feminist struggle, we have had to fight long and hard for every small scrap of recognition and equality. It's interesting to me that we don't have a like archetype for the male, although there are charismatic Merlin-type wizard archetypes, dignified male professors and experts in their field, and Pluto, Hades, or the devil archetypes for large negative male deities. We don't have an archetype that gathers together the worst aspects of old age in the male and funnels them into one noun like hag or crone. In fact, neither gender has a simple, respectful title other than elder, which is a word we have in recent times borrowed from indigenous cultures. It seems to me that the Cailleacha, like many other female archetypes, is used as a warning, a dictate of what not to become. Having been distorted from her earlier powers, she is used to control and sanitize the way older women age. In her extremes of ugliness and near repulsion, women are steered away from being seen to be anything like her. And yet, assuredly, it is by going deeper into this archetype that we can unravel the spell of shame that patriarchy has cast over her and reclaim the true power, weight, and significance of the older woman. By cleaving ourselves to the Cailleacha, we can again see our immanence. I feel we already know everything we need to about the crone and the hag, and yet we hear so little about the true power of the Cailleacha, and so little about the wisdom of the older woman. But rather than repeating patriarchal dogma about this figure in our psyche, I want to take us inwards towards what we might innately, intuitively recognize to be true about the Cailleacha and the voice of the older wise woman, a voice I think of as the indigenous feminine. To really connect to the Cailleacha, we may need to take a moment to feel our way back before the modern era, back before the Norman conquest, back before the Vikings with their Norse gods and goddesses, back before Christianity, before the Romans, to the Celts, and to the tribes that were here before them. In that liminal space of imagining, we can start to find a more true connection to the earth goddess and to the positive wise woman archetype that the word Cailleacha truly represents. At that time, we humans were more deeply connected to the place we lived, more sensitive to its complex tapestry of threads that is the weave of nature. We were grateful to the spirits of place, to water, to the well, the stream, the river, deeply appreciative of the landscape and its soils, and the way the moon hung in the sky, grateful for each wildflower and tree, each visiting bird and creature. Embedded and interwoven within the natural world, it was not so very separate to ourselves. Enthreaded with the inherent creative energies of place, we recognized that the intelligence which animated the plants, elements, and animals was the same intelligence that animated ourselves. Connection to the Cailleacha taught us mutuality and similarity, and it let us look to the creatures and honor their otherness without demeaning them. Within that Cailleacha-infused world, the elder wise woman intimately knew all phases of life, had witnessed its light and dark. Leaders within the clan, voices of expertise, holders of repositories of knowledge, herbal lore, medicine, and plant wisdom. These women had lived and endured, had seen tragedy, and yet knew how to overcome, how to transform and make sense of suffering. These women would have advised us, as the indigenous elders have always done, to look after all members of the clan, to not take too much, to not desecrate the land. When was it that the wise voice of the older woman began to be inconvenient? I suspect it was about the time humanity got more possessions, gold, sheep, horses, when we ceased to share among the tribe, the time when we learned that glittery possessions could distance us from the raw, painful realities of life, that the wise women knew how to suffer and make sense of. Gradually, as we go forwards again through time, through the Celtic invasions, the Romans, the Vikings, as more and more women lost their sons to battle and plunder, the voice that was saying, "No, you may not harm the children of other women, or burn crops, or destroy homes," that voice was not listened to. Avarice and masculine values won over the voice of the Cailleach. The voice of the indigenous feminine became a voice to be routinely ignored. Her sanctity was disallowed. And yet, here we are now in the 21st century on the brink of environmental collapse, perhaps solely because we did not listen to what the indigenous feminine was saying all along. Our climate and biodiversity emergencies are, after all, manifestations of a crisis in human values. Having prioritized economic progress over planetary concern, we are left with the likelihood of extinction unless we reevaluate our values. But all this begs the question, whose values have driven society? And were there other values, say female values, which Westernism chose to ignore and demean? We can perhaps understand the Cailleach as the truth, but because she has the power to create darkness, she is also the manifest consequences of when we ignore truth. So if our government fails to heed the call for tighter pollution controls, she manifests as scum floating on the rivers, as our oceans awash with plastics. The Cailleach is truth made manifest. She comes through us as indigenous wisdom, or she manifests as the ugliness that ignoring wisdom creates. She is brave enough to take on ugly form to reveal truth. If we silence our truth, we watch it manifest in the world as something ugly. If we don't speak out and protest against war, there is the bloody battlefield of the Cailleach. She is, at the end of the day, feminine power, and when feminine power is silenced, the consequences are hideous. As women, we quest throughout our lives to understand our own power. What might it mean to be a powerful woman? Are we to ape masculine ideas of power, or is our task to gyre around our core and define it for ourselves? Our power is a core of selfhood that we spend our lives voyaging toward. We touch her as young women. We touch her in our middle years, within career and within mothering. But by the time we reach menopause and age, we are her. We have become women who walk in the world from our place of power. Not because society gives it to us, it doesn't, or because we earn it, but because we find our power within ourselves. Even if our own culture negates the wisdom and sanctity of the crone, we embody her anyway. Much as a tree after the glory of summer sheds leaves and gives way to autumn, we move into our winter with the Cailleach, flowing towards a surrender and powerlessness of the natural kind, the natural order, the vulnerability we each of us have to navigate age, illness, and dying. The Cailleach holds our hand within our vulnerability. She holds us, shelters us, enables us to look at our own ugliness and decay. She helps us to let go of youth and step into our other strengths, just as Bridget was there as midwife, birthing us. The Cailleach accompanies us into age and dying. She leaves us strong enough to cope with the tragedy of the insufferable and the unbearable.
Grace, thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful. You brought us through all of the both negative and positive representations of older women, and also the absences as well as the presences, in a way that wasn't just informed and historically very stimulating and poetic, but also, because we're all visual artists here, very visual. We'd accept you among the ranks of the visual artists any day, because you put together such amazing images to go with your talk. So I'm going to open up to questions if we have any, and also introduce the two people who've joined me on the platform here now, who are on my right, Helen Comerford, a painter, member of the Cailleacha, based in County Kilkenny, who has been doing work. She began, at least my earliest knowledge of Helen's work was of work that was very feminist and about women's issues and women's visibility, and has gone on to be much more archetypal in its concerns with the connection between womanhood and the planet, really. But I'll leave Helen to talk about that herself. Before I do, I would like to also introduce Gerda Cailleacha, who came to Ireland from Amsterdam many years ago and has lived here as an artist and also as somebody who's very involved in the arts as a sort of, apart from her own art practice, which you can see on the wall behind us, in fact, also very, very concerned with the importance of art as a means of expression that helps people to get to know themselves better and deal with themselves. So we're bringing you in to talk about the health aspects of this as much as anything else, Gerda. Okay, so are there any comments that anybody wants to? Well, let me start by asking each of my co-panelists to say a few words about why they're in the Cailleacha and what you got out of this morning. Who'd like to start? Gerda, would you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. I was hoping you would, Gerda. Yeah, and I found really the notion that what we have stumbled on in forming the Cailleacha has a root in science, that everything that we didn't really think about at the beginning proves to be something that we should have been doing. That is really reassuring, and sort of how women think a bit. I think we from a creative sort of mobile space, we come to decisions in such a different way to the masculine principle of, which has led us to sort of dogma and rigidity and war and so on. And that talk has really started me to think about this mobility and be very grateful that we have formed the Cailleacha.
Yes, and actually I should mention that Grace is here with us by telephone, not here with us, but present in that other virtual way. I mean, I think if COVID has taught us anything, it has taught us, you know, we always thought about presences. Presences are present now in ways that they never were before. But it's great to have you back with us, Grace. Yeah, I think I was delighted that you mentioned Mary Condren and the Serpent and the Goddess, which I think is a really informative start for all of this. She taught with me in Gender and Women's Studies in Trinity College years ago, and she was, you know, a real plank in the education that was put out from Trinity over the years in relation to women. Yeah, you talked about shy women, about how people were taught to shy away from the ugliness of the crone, and related that to the few archetypes that we have of men, which don't really seem to have caught the public imagination at all in the way that the archetype of the woman has. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Well, I suppose my fear was I was wrong. And I'm waiting for somebody to say, we do have a noun for this older man, the negative older man, but I can't think of it. You know, if I'm imagining an elder man coming toward me, and I can't kind of go, oh, there's a lad, or there's a, you know, we just don't have that. And I think that female archetypes, it's so fundamental. If we don't have this energetic archetypal field to go toward, a positive to go toward, whether it's around female sexuality or mothering or anything, then there's something that the soul is calling for that it doesn't, it's a nurture, it doesn't receive. So it's really exciting to me that you are coming forward and just challenging this crone and the archetypes around old women or older women and age. I mean, we're just in such a mess. I was looking, you know, for this image, and the older woman is now very glossy. And that's an incredibly hard archetype to move toward. Having been glossy all our lives, do we now have to be glossy in age as well? So I'm sure there's a lot to say about it, Catherine, but I'm not quite sure what to say about that. But I'm very curious to have anybody respond around the idea of the archetypes. And I feel fundamentally that is what you are moving into. And it doesn't surprise me at all that a group of women artists would do that, because I think all your lives you've been doing that in one way or another, challenging archetypes and creating archetypal fields that my generation just behind you could come into with greater ease. So it's a sort of, the archetype is so much to do with feminine identity and what we are enabled or allowed to identify ourselves as. There's a lot of missing archetypes, like the sort of the female adventurer, the explorer, the the star of the show. There's a whole load of sort of missing female archetypes. So I think that's particularly true around aging.
Actually, you mentioned the pressure on us to be glossy in older age. You just have to look at the 8 members of Cailleacha and forget about glossiness. We're not into it, aren't we? So, yeah. I remember actually back in about 1990, I gave a lecture in Kilkenny on history of art and feminism, or some such. I mean, that was the key, the center of it. But a woman came up to me at the end of it, and I was exhausted because I had poured my heart out for about an hour. And she came up to me and she said, she wouldn't put this question from the floor. She came right up to me, face to face, to say it. She said, I really admire you because you stood up there in front of everybody without any makeup. I don't wear makeup because I don't know how to put it on even. You know, that's the be all and end all of it. But that stayed with me ever since, because it was so important to that woman that we have to have makeup on to go out. It wasn't that I fell short. And anyway, she wasn't saying that, you know, she was very nice. But anyway, I don't think I've ever seen much makeup among the Cailleachs in all the times that we've met and worked together. Have you?
Not much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, Grace. We knew each other in Jerpoint.
Indeed we did, Helen, and your work was so stunning then, and I'm delighted to see you here again. It's just wonderful. And such a huge figure. I was thinking about each of you and the influence that you would have each had on communities, and you know, you've taught so many people. You just expanded this whole field of our possibilities. So I just, you know, if you could combine those energies of each of you, the radiance, or the radius of your radiance, and the influences of people and women you've affected, it's just phenomenal.
But you did touch on something, Grace, at least you didn't actually talk about it, but it's something that comes out of what you said. And even this relates to the glossiness as well. That notion that women have to appear a certain way, and when post-menstrual, post-menopause, I should say, there's a great deal of fear out there that women will start to look ugly and not be attractive in the way that they were made to need to be all their lives. So I think that fear is one of the things we're interested in. Gerda, I'd love you to say something about that, if you would, because you've been working so much with community groups and people. How do we deal with that kind of fear that so many women have?
After the menopause.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the fear of getting, I mean, ultimately it is the fear of getting older and of mortality, which we might get round to talking about, but it is also a change in visibility and a loss of visibility as well.
It's the attractiveness, I think, is very important. That's the feeling, because the skin is not the same. And is this heard? Oh yeah. Because you lose estrogen, isn't it estrogen? Yeah. And so the skin is not as full as the sacking. And it probably has a lot to do with the impression men probably have, or the women feel they're less attractive to men. That might be in... But there is also, beside that, is the medical situation that you might get very insecure. There's a whole lot of things about it. But I think there used to be a shame about talking about it. It was not something you discuss or something which was hidden. I think it's only coming now, if I look at the television, what is talked about and what is advertised. That's all, like menstruation as well, and lack of bladder control, and a whole lot of issues are coming to the fore now. I think it's much more talked about. But when we had the periods, it wasn't talked about. I find it also kind of...
That's right. Now it's
something
celebrated.
should be hidden. Yeah, and now it's celebrated, yeah.
There's been a lot of talk on radio, I believe, in the last week or two about the menopause and how many women really suffered during the menopause, and that's partly because they couldn't talk about it, you know?
Yeah, which is fantastic, yeah. But, it's not something to be ashamed of, because when it's hidden, it's also something you feel it's to be ashamed about. It's not to be ashamed, it's a natural. It's natural to women. It's part, well, we should celebrate it really, because without it, we have serious consequences.
Both Helen and in your practice, Helen, and Grace in your talk talked about the goddess and the importance of archetypes for us. I think one of the things that we should mention, actually, Grace, because you may not have seen it already, and neither may any people who are listening in or looking in who haven't seen the exhibition yet, there's a very powerful piece of work in the exhibition by Barbara Freeman, which who couldn't be with us today, but it is about aging skin and the skin of the landscape and the connection between the two. We are of the landscape, we age with the landscape, we continue through the landscape in some way. And your talk also brought that out very nicely. But if you get a chance, drop in and have a look at it. I think you'll enjoy it. Okay, I think maybe a nice thing to do would be to look at the positive things that creativity has helped us to get out of aging. Are we afraid of aging now? Are we happy to embrace it? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, no.
Gerda?
I feel much stronger since I'm with Cailleacha, actually. I wasn't terribly worried about aging. I've been very lucky that I can move well and can do things. But since I'm with Cailleacha, it's a shared thing, what's happening, which is so different than when you're doing it by yourself. And we share very many things, but not only the art and the process of our artwork, but also we have little things because of aging, and nobody seems to be worried about in Cailleacha. It's a kind of part it's to embrace. And I must say, especially after 70, but more after 75, that I embrace it. And I enjoy all the things, and I like my wrinkles because I like lines, and I like the lines in my face as well. It's all part of, and also at times I don't recognize my skin, and then I think, no, that's also part of the process. My skin is changing. Things, my brain is changing slightly. Although I want to do so many things. I think I'm only starting. Because of all the inspiration with the Cailleacha, I feel I'm starting on a new road, and I want to continue that. So I'm basically only starting. And so, no, I only feel joy and just feel so happy that I'm able to go through this, and that I can share things, but also for my children. And I feel for younger people that they can see, okay, there is no end to, it's only when you die things stop. But before that, you can do anything. You can get the maximum out of your own ability, mentally and physically. And I think that's important. So I see it as a very positive thing, and that we're lucky that we live now, that it can be celebrated.
Sure. Helen, would you like to say anything about that? Or how does it feel
yeah. I feel very grateful to have meaningful work, I suppose, at this stage of my life. And something I sought for years and didn't get there was just to be totally present in the studio. So instead of my mind racing and unpaid bills coming in and responsibilities all over the place, I can go to the studio now and be just totally there in total concentration. And I'm really grateful for that. We women are really good at multitasking, I think, but then to be able not to multitask anymore, and I think that has to do with age or stage, I'm not sure which, but yeah, grateful is my word.
Can I quote you something I just read from a review that came out this week in the Dublin Review of Books by Rosita Boland? She was reviewing a new book on Francis Bacon. She says, and I quote, "Old age, as Katharine Hepburn once said, is not for sissies. Francis Bacon did his best. Ill with asthma, high blood pressure, a cancerous kidney, a dodgy liver, a dodgy heart, kept going with champagne and fistfuls of pills, including amphetamines. He was," quoting Bacon now, "he was living on time, wrenched from the teeth and claws of death. The nearer I get to death," Bacon said, "the stronger the urge to paint." Isn't that fantastic? So to come back to where Roseanne Kenny also left us, talking about the value of creativity and social engagement. Creativity, in whatever form we have it, is a way of communicating with people. It is a form of social engagement, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I don't know, Grace, whether it was you or Roseanne touched on actually it was Roseanne. She mentioned religion in that community, Rosetta, that she talked about, which helped to bind people together. Yeah. We all live in a kind of post-religious, post-Christian age now. But we need the arts more than ever in place of that, I think, to remind us of our spiritual values and give us something bigger than ourselves to think about. Would either of you like to say anything about that? Or Grace, do you want to come in on that?
Well, I suppose I can a bit. Catherine, I think it's very exciting when you look at the internet around goddess spirituality, for example. It's just a blossoming field. There are so many images. Even though the patriarchal religions are fading, you know, all of that is crumbling very clearly. And that causes huge problems for society not to have this kind of spiritual flame at the center. It's more dispersed into the individual now, and each person is sort of finding their own flame and what that might look like. And for women, that's a huge connection to Celtic spirituality and the Cailleacha and Bridget and all of these things. That, you know, there was a time you might have maybe one event around Bridget's Day in February. This year, there were just a month of events. And so I think people are, it's like we've reached a point where we are suddenly coming back to where we started. It's time to see spirituality within the earth. It's time to see spirituality within ourselves. And I think that the possibilities of that through creativity, you know, for me, it's all enmeshed. It's all the one. But I see that coming in many different realms. I see the environmentalists talking about spirituality now, and the immanence within the earth and within nature and things. So I do think there is, even though one system is dying, another is growing. And it's really, can we get there fast enough? Can we create that kind of spiritual sense around ourselves, around nature, the planet? Can we get that in time for the planet, which is in such trouble?
Sure. Helen, do you feel optimistic? Can we get it in time?
Well, I think all of us have been working all our lives, really. And I think the frame of mind that we're now in is also a result, though. Could you start now? I wonder.
Well,
could you?
Gerda said she's starting now.
Oh, well, no, but how long have you been working?
I've been working for many years, and like yourself, I had to do many other jobs, yes. And it's only, say, 60 something, near 70s that I really could just work in my studio. So I feel I'm still developing. I haven't reached what I hope to be able to reach. You know, so I'm still kind of working on that, and I just feel I want to just spend many years. I need many years to develop that and to get into that space and to create this beautiful piece, my best piece.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel, that it would be an awful waste to stop now.
Yes,
you know?
yes.
That all this experience and all this work we've been doing,
and losing the garbage,
needs to be brought forward.
I feel very strongly about that. Yeah. So upwards and onwards. So
I think it's really addressing the question: what are you going to do when you grow up?
Yeah. And I was thinking, this is a different thing, but when Roseanne was talking about social interaction, how important it is and all that, which is in a way also connected with religion. But when I was working in the care center, in various care centers, people were together, but they were isolated together. They were all in their own space, and there was no interaction. And that interaction came when arts activities were done and people started changing and interacting through artwork. That became very meaningful to them. And I'm just thinking with the modern age, with everybody's looking at their little implemented
their iPads and things like that.
And that's also a form of isolation, social isolation, cannot be?
Yeah, isolation is something that we didn't talk about, but Roseanne did.
Yeah.
And I was really interested, actually I wrote it down when she was talking. She said that loneliness and social isolation trigger inflammation, and she actually had figures for that. Do you remember? Inflammation, and she talked about the olfactory cavity in your nose and stuff.
Yeah.
And related all of that to isolation and the lack of social engagement. And I found that incredibly interesting, actually.
Yeah.
What I also liked about her presentation was that she moved from a social group and how they looked after and nurtured each other to talking about a baboon and the mother and daughter relationship, which is then replaced by other social relationships with baboons. So there's a lovely relationship between the human and the animal in her talk, and in yours, Grace, between the human and the geological, which is what was going on in Barbara's work as well, particularly, but in everybody's to some extent. So it's lovely to see that connection to the earth, and boy, do we have to work on it now to try and save it in time, save the world in time, really.
It's a very short day.
Yeah. The other thing that Roseanne said, which I noticed, was that creativity was a cheap and cheerful way to arrive at social engagement.
Yes,
let's think
that
about that,
struck me.
everybody.
That struck me. Yeah.
Do we want to be cheap and cheerful? I mean, I think
I think she mentioned funding. Within the health board structure, spending money on creativity is a relatively cheap and cheerful thing to do, as opposed to buying a heart transplant machinery or whatever that kind of thing is. So I think she wasn't talking to us so much as toward the health institutions, that an understanding of bringing in creativity was a relatively cheap and cheerful thing. That was my understanding of it.
to be fair, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
But if you extend that out into the world, actually, the arts are seen as a cheap and cheerful way of keeping things stable and good. And, you know, in lots of ways, projects that you deliver through care homes and institutions of various kinds are very cheap and cheerful relative to the cost of, say, the health services and stuff. And even a friend of mine did a study some years ago, which she never completed, unfortunately, about how the Arts in Prison scheme, how much that contributed to turning young offenders into people with a different view of themselves, so they were less likely to reoffend when they went back out into the world. So there are all kinds of ways of generating a healthy society that the arts can be centrally involved in. But of course, for those professionals in the arts, they need to be valued while they do that. And that's an ongoing struggle for all of us. And probably more of a struggle as you get older rather than, well, no, I don't know. It's 50-50. I think it's fairly well spread out.
I think as well, isolation is kind of deeply connected to the Cailleacha. I mean, we wouldn't have isolation in older age if the elders were more respected within society, if the crone was, instead of being sort of pushed away as a crone that we don't want to think about, if she's brought back in as a wise presence, then the older woman is more sewn into the society. But we've kind of taken her out. She's like a thread of a weave. You don't really see older women presenting television. You get a rare person like Olivia O'Leary, for example, who is able to kind of come in because she's recognized as somebody who's very intelligent. So we can have this intelligent older woman. But why don't we have a whole range of Olivia O'Learys? I should be able to name off 20 intelligent older women who are in the media all the time. But I don't think they are. I think that that's a thing that's sort of, so these threads of where the older woman in society, she's sort of been slipped away in many places, which leads to greater isolation. So if we can have a kind of cultural reabsorption of the elder woman as the wise presence who we need throughout society, then I think we would have less isolation as well. It's not, I don't think the responsibility for our isolation needs to rest within ourselves. It's also a culturally imposed isolation because we're perceived as crone, who's not quite relevant.
And allied to the perception of the crone and the isolation that goes with that is, of course, the notion that we don't any longer care for older people in the home in the way that we always did traditionally. So I wonder how much that isolation, putting people into homes and separating them from the social unit that they were part of, it might put older people, it might sort of lock them up together, but it doesn't do anything to help them to be a part of that more active fabric of society that you're talking about, where they can contribute. I'm thinking of Moya Cannon's poem, which you probably know, Grace, Carrying the Songs. Do you know that poem? It's about an old woman who's dying, and on her deathbed, the thing that she worries about is who will carry the songs that she has carried for generations onto the next generation. And you can do that if the older person is still living in the family unit. especially because older people pass things on to the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. But if they're not there to do it, they can't. So that's something we need to work. I mean, once we identify the wrongs, we can try to find strategies for putting them right. I do not want to say that every family should struggle to keep an elderly person at home if they can't, because society has changed and it's very difficult. But at the same time, if they can't do it, then we must find other ways of keeping those connections very tight.
Yeah, that's absolutely, and it is possible. But it needs to be the right kind of philosophy. I used to see the enormous change when I was working in the Midlands in Ferry, but that's a few years ago now, so I hope things are changed meanwhile. But I saw the difference what was happening here and what is happening in the Netherlands, which is a small country, very densely populated, so it's easier there to have people in the center of town or the villages in a shelter home or in a society that they can just walk out and be part of the society they always were part of. And they're still independent, they still can make decisions for themselves. But that's a bit hard, much harder in Ireland with the distances, and the villages are very small. But there must be a way to create something like that people, because we heard so much about social isolation during COVID and that people are on their own. It must be possible to change that.
There's a lovely example in Inishmore, where older people who could no longer manage for themselves had to go to the mainland to homes, I suppose, and the community built a home there, and it really works. Their children, their grandchildren can call in at any time. They're not isolated, and they have their wonderful island and sea still present, because it must have been heart-wrenching for them to have to leave at that point of their lives. So I think the answer lies in community action as well, doesn't it? Uillinn Arts Centre have a great programme for going into old folks' homes. Can't remember the right title for it. And they're collecting these stories and they're collecting these songs and they're giving value to the people there.
And it is the arts that is doing that.
It is.
I think on that note, we're going to have to wrap up. Grace, thank you so much. Thanks to Roseanne, even though I don't think that she's picking us up anywhere, but it's very important that we had her contribution, and it was actually inspiring. Yours too, Grace, thank you so much. And thank you to all those people who are looking in. We'll be back after a lunch break at 2:00. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Grace.